1968 was one of the fiercest years that the American war in Vietnam witnessed. That October, 19-year-old Californian Ross Canton was drafted and sent to Vietnam. He was based in Trang Bang district in the southeastern province of Tây Ninh. Canton served as a radio operator for a U.S. Infantry Division. His return home after 6 months in the war witnessed him delve actively into the anti-war movement. The years thereafter saw Canton struggle to overcome post-traumatic stress disorder, known commonly as PTSD. He would learn to heal himself through self-written poetry. Canton's aspiration has been to help other veterans suffering from the same plight of PTSD. For every hour since the end of the war, this multiply has been attributed to being among the leading causes pushing at least one U.S. veteran into the path of committing suicide. 46 years after he left Trang Bang, Canton is now revisiting the old battlefields. It is here where he hopes to complete his journey of healing and to say thank you to those once on the other side of the battlefront, those who now greet him like an old friend.
Hello and welcome to Talk Vietnam, and we get the chance to meet Ross in our Talk Vietnam today. So Ross, thank you so much for your time and being in our show. So in your memory, how fierce the war was?
My division and in Trang Bang province was a very difficult place to fight, and we had many battles. I would say we would have an event happen at least once a day throughout the 6 months that I was there. Whether it would have been a mortar attack or an ambush or a booby trap or a fierce battle as well.
So as a radio operator, is there any story that you have witnessed?
Yes, I would say many, but my first day carrying the radio for the company, we happened to go to Trang Bang along Highway 1. And as we were getting close to Trang Bang village, a bomb went off. I was about 50 meters from the explosion because my platoon was the third in the line of platoons. The point man from the first platoon was wounded in that explosion. This was my first day in the war. Mm-hmm. And as I got up to where the wounded man was laying, he was an African American who had gotten drafted as well. And sitting nearby was the perpetrator of that bomb, supposedly, who happened to be about a 9 or 10-year-old boy. For an American like myself, who had been trained to and indoctrinated into a war about fighting communism and seeing images of an army, to see that the enemy was a 9 or 10-year-old boy, that was the day that changed my perspective of the war.
At the very first day?
And that was my first day.
Oh, yeah.
And I said to myself, if this is the enemy, what kind of war are we fighting? Who is the enemy? How can a 9 or 10-year-old boy be the enemy?
Yeah.
So, yes, that was the turning point, and from there, it went on from there. Say you carried a camera, a Nikon maybe, and you were on a road heading towards some village, and there were voices, sounds shimmering off the tar, a water buffalo's moans, a rooster's call, an F-14 ripping through the sky's blue flag, and out of that blue a black seed falls, a shrill whistle from hell, a dark pod blossoming into licorice flames. And there's a girl running toward you, her clothes burned off, her flesh on fire with the sweet licorice-smelling gasoline, her tears dry smears of char. And so you click, swallow the winged terror fluttering in your chest, and click, cup her searing cry in your palms. Non quoi, she screams, too hot. But the words don't reach where you are, running, flagging a truck, a medic, a friend. You dig through the chaos of uncounted bodies, but you can't find a pulse. You breathe in the killing fire, but you don't die. Your face becomes proof, your heart witness, your eyes this smoked lens, these charred pages, this black silk of her skin.
Did you get the war obsessions after like 6 months doing that duty?
If you're relating to PTSD, post-traumatic stress syndrome, yes. I actually had what they called combat fatigue after the second time I got wounded, and started having what they call the shakes. And that was in the field. That was about 5 months into my tour. I would, when the bombs would go off and mortar attacks, I would be shaking and paralyzed. The last time when I got wounded was in Trang Bang, where our battalion had what they call a fire support base. It was fire support base Pershing. I was wounded by an 82 millimeter mortar. In that wounding, the mortar landed as close as the picture behind you to me. I was lucky to have survived. I spent 9.5 months in the hospital, and it took a long time after that to get my brain to work the way it does now. I had short-term memory loss, and I could not make an emotional connection to my wife or any photos from my past before I had gotten wounded. So I could see a photograph, I could see the picture of my wife, and I could recognize, they would say, "This is Janice." And I would say, "Janice, yes, I know Janice." But I had no memory beyond the face, no past, no past. And the same was true with my mother.
Oh my God.
That was a long time coming back, and a different person came from that, because the brain rewired itself.
How about your going home story after you was discharged from your duty in Vietnam?
My family welcomed me back as best as they could, but it was very, very difficult for them because the war changed us so much. You know, you're 19, you go to war, you're all happy,
Yeah.
you're young, your life is ahead of you. And when I came back, I couldn't move my arm well. I couldn't do any of the things that I had done before. I couldn't think well. I couldn't love my wife in an emotional way. Mm-hmm. It was flat affect, flat, and so they suffered through that whole 5 to 10 year rehabilitation that it took me to really come back to feel comfortable inside my own body again. Mm-hmm. And that was true of all the families of Vietnam veterans who were combat veterans who suffered from wounds or suffered from PTSD when they came back. Remember, PTSD, we had nightmares, we were volatile, we had all sorts of things that our families didn't know how to deal with.
Post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD, is a mental disorder that affects some 7.1 million American adults. In the US, the disorder became more prevalently known in the 70s and 80s through war veterans. Many soldiers who had witnessed the brutality of the battlefield or who had looked death in the eye came home to struggle with recurring trauma, depression, constant fear, and substance abuse, among many symptoms. According to the US National Institute of Health, PTSD has hit 13% of the country's entire veteran population. In the 8.2 million US veterans who are from the Vietnam War era, at least 31% have suffered from PTSD. This psychological disorder is one that has pushed many veterans to the point of ending their own lives. The US Department of Veteran Affairs in 2012 estimated that as many as 22 veterans die each day by suicide.
You just talk about PTSD, so when and how did you find out that you have such a symptom of PTSD?
It's a funny thing with our government. It takes them a long time to accept responsibility for things that they know are their responsibility. With PTSD, the Vietnam veterans came back and the government denied that we had any problems. But the problems that we had were substance abuse, depression, alcoholism, the kind of volatility where you would go into rages one moment and then not talk to anyone the next. Hypervigilance is another one that we had. Inability, as I said, to love my wife. PTSD doesn't allow you to be intimate anymore. Yeah. Because somehow it changes your ability to trust. And one thing you have to have with intimacy is trust. With relationship to the government, them not accepting that we had those problems, they basically would characterize post-traumatic stress syndrome as a symptom of cowardice, as a symptom of weakness.
Really?
Oh, you should be stronger, you should not have these injuries. That leads to the kind of depression that we see. For instance, some of the numbers that Vietnam veterans, there were 8 million veterans that served in the Vietnam War or the American War. Almost 4 million of them suffered from post-traumatic stress syndrome.
Wow.
Of the 4 million, 50% of them, or 2 million, said that they were suffering from something. Of them, only 25% received any kind of help from the Veterans Administration, and that took a long time. The other thing you have to understand is we ourselves, because we were draftees, because we came home and joined each other, we set up our own ways of therapy. We had groups and we called it talk therapy. We talked to each other. We would set up groups and tell about our stories, and the sharing of our stories, the sharing of the horror. And it's after all these many years, I still have moments of that I have to catch my breath to have control of my emotions.
Oh.
But in those days, we were very, very raw. And when we would sit around a group, you can imagine a group of strong men breaking down and sobbing because of just telling the stories. One of the medics, and this is a very sad and interesting kind of story because it shows that you didn't have to be a fighter to have PTSD. You could be a radio operator like myself and be a witness. His name was Steve, and Steve was a medic, and his PTSD, or his nightmare, the nightmare that he had came from helping a girl who had suffered from napalm burns on her arms. And he broke down and started crying when he was talking about how she was in such pain and nobody could do anything for her. And so he took a sponge of soap suds from a bucket and that soothed her arms. And that was his story. The soothing of her arms as a medic had him break down in tears because that's all he could do. That was it. The horror of seeing her with those wounds, the horror of remembering that moment. So that's one of the stories that we would have in our group therapy. No psychologists or psychiatrists. It was just a group of Vietnam veterans originally, because the Veterans Administration didn't acknowledge that we had anything.
Want by R.G. Cantalupo. Baby son wanted horses mostly. Mustangs and Appaloosas. A small ranch outside Tucson with a good woman and a few sons. The crackle of green bullets igniting the air outside. Far away now, as we sat and drank and lied. And killed the day. Each of us wanting what we knew we couldn't have. Till it was time to go. And one by one, we stepped through the blinding doorway.
So I understand that you overcome your PTSD problem, and you even decided to become the psychologist and helping others, veterans who suffer from the same problem, to overcome that problem as you already do.
Post-traumatic stress syndrome, I believe, is or can be a lifelong illness. It's like a chronic illness, and certain things trigger it. I still suffer from PTSD. I'm just able to deal with it a little bit better than many veterans, and I've learned to deal with it a little bit better through various techniques and various ways of sharing. One of them is through writing, which helps dramatically. But my involvement with crisis intervention was seeing veterans who couldn't deal with life. They would be homeless. They would be, alcoholics on the street, homeless people on the street, hearing voices, or chronically depressed, or committing suicide.
Oh.
The numbers are astounding. In Vietnam, we have one Vietnam veteran commits suicide every hour of every day. And
Up until now?
yes, still.
Oh my goodness.
I think the number last year was approximately 8,000 veterans had committed suicide. The Iraqi veterans and the Afghan veterans, their numbers are even higher than ours. So at a point in my life, I thought that maybe I could help through becoming a psychologist, and I did. I was involved with crisis intervention. I helped for about 5 years. My problem was it was too much for me as an individual to do that.
Yes.
I could only take it for so long, and then I had to find my own path of healing, because trying to heal others became too much.
So I have noticed that you have raised a lot of questions concerning the unexploded ordnance or UXO's victims during your time visiting the Project Renew Visitor Center in Quảng Trị province. So what are your thoughts after learning facts about them?
My journey back to Vietnam has been not only a personal journey, but also a public journey, and a discovery of so much I didn't know, so much ignorance, I would say. The Renew, the people at the Renew organization astounded me with their numbers. That just in those 4 districts, 7,000 ordnance, 7,000 bombs were found in a year. That's immense. I mean, how do you have a farm? How do you every year when you have the rainy season, you have more bombs that come up, and then how do you disarm them? There's only a little small group of people there, and your country is an emerging country. How do you deal with these kinds of things? We have to spend millions and millions of dollars dealing with a war that happened almost 50 years ago because of the ordnance that is in the ground, the bombs that keep coming up, the children that can touch one. The thing that I was most amazed with was the model that I was shown from Renew of the education. Just the education of school children alone has saved many lives. But it's such a large issue. We were talking about Quang Tri province, I believe it is, and that's only one district, I guess, not one province. Bien Hoa province is another huge province where many bombs, and that I think is just starting. Those are just 2 provinces within your country. And yes, maybe those were the highest places that bombs were dropped in the South, but that's only 2 provinces. And those numbers, having 7,000 1 year, 4 districts of 1 province, how many in the 10 districts of that province is the number 20,000 ordinances in 1 year that you find? And what are those ordinances? Are they the cluster bombs that are plastic, you know, that you can't even detect and that look like tennis balls or something like that? To a young child, what is it? If they weren't educated and in your poorest areas, maybe the children don't hear about it. Maybe they miss that lesson. For me, the numbers after 50 years was heartbreaking, and the stories were heartbreaking. I feel publicly when I go back to the United States that one of my jobs is to educate the American public and the American veterans, the communities that I am involved with, of just how large a problem we left behind.
So you seems to be like really concerned about Agent Orange issues here in the country. And during this trip to Vietnam, you had chance to meet with those victims of Agent Orange from in Hanoi, in Quang Tri, in Da Nang, and yeah. So what do you think, like during meeting with them?
I was very inspired by all of them. Like I said, I mean, I think that they are the ongoing heroes now, because what are they dealing with? They're dealing with the legacy of the war. They're doing everything they can to help after almost 50 years later to have a better life for your country in the future and for your future generations. I wish there were more of them, and I wish there was more money, and I think that that's something that all of us peace activists that came here as a group have been determined to do when we go back to the United States, to do something about that, to try and generate more funding, to generate more help. It's a learning process for us. Also was astounding to me to discover that you have 4 generations now, I believe, 4 generations of birth defects. The group went to do hospital, and they came back. They'll never forget those images, and those images should be shared with the American public. They're hard to see, but they need to be seen.
Now, this is the first time Ross came back to Vietnam after decades since the end of the war. And Ross came up with an idea of coming back and search for his old battlefield in Trang Bang district of Tây Ninh province. Let's follow him in this journey of emotion where he eventually sought to heal and find himself.
Upon reaching Trang Bang, where he was based more than 4 decades ago, Canton is filled with emotions.
Sadness, grief, loss, those are the most dominant emotions I feel right now, is coming back and seeing this place where I was a young man, and so much of my youth was lost during that time here.
The trip awakes unpleasant memories inside Canton. They include the heavy downpours of napalm bombs, burning houses and civilians. Then a radio operator, Canton received and delivered commands to initiate such bombings from his superiors to units. Nick was napalm girl photograph, also taken in Trang Bang, therefore carved into his heart a painful impression.
There were times when we fired those bombs on villages and the villages burned up, but there was no Nick out there to see the damage. There was no capturing those moments. It's only inside my memory.
To make peace with his memory, Canton has found his way to where the photo was taken 44 years ago. Although the place looks different now, it still conjures up in him flashbacks and trauma from the old days.
Đằng sau cái lùm cây này nè, trong xóm đó đó, đánh bom rồi sau nó cháy nó mới đầu chạy ra đây.
And that's the smoke behind,
Đó
right?
làng cây không à.
Yes. To drop a 500-pound bomb, what are you dropping it on? Are you dropping it on a little house? So I'm connected to all of it. I'm connected to the place. This place, in this photo, I knew that place so well.
Accompanying Canton to this old base are two veterans of the Vietnam People's Army. It is right at its bridge and the river that Canton realized that back then, he and Colonel Phạm Văn Cực were sometimes stationed only an arm's length away from one another. They might have even pointed guns at each other without ever realizing it.
You told me that your base was here. He asked me what we would do, what I would do every day. We were always looking for your base, but we never found it. We never knew. They were right there, hiding. Came out at night. 400? We never imagined.
Trong cuộc chiến á, mình xác định là một bên là mình, một bên là địch, là phải đánh nhau, nhưng mà đất nước hòa bình là thôi, mình coi như mình xóa bỏ hận thù, còn cuộc sống lại là rất là vui mừng.
After all these years later, now we come as friends to each other. It's a cleansing feeling. That for me is reconciliation. And I want to share that burden being lifted with other veterans when I go home, because it's really important.
What urged you to be back to that old battlefield?
There's two parts to the reason I came back after all these many years. One was that I was finally able to finish the memoir, and this was the last chapter. So there was a personal journey, and for me to see where I got wounded and almost died, and how that has affected my whole life, to see that and touch it. To touch it is different than what I remember. So there was that part. But there was more than that part, was that in the United States right now, there is this whole revision of the war that's going on, and from an American perspective. And the chapter that they're leaving out is the chapter of dissent that caused the war to end, ultimately to end. To leave out that chapter and put the history books as that the Americans decided to have a peace accord on their own is false, and it's a false history, and I felt it was time to be a part of that.
So, if you have a chance to talk to the U.S. veterans who are still hesitate to come back to the country, what would you say?
I would say that the only way to feel cleansed of that very, very bad time in your life that has stained your life is to come back and to not come back as a tourist, but to come back as a friend, to come back and to understand the people.
No thanks is an elegy and a flag of protest. Through poems, stories, and journal entries, it gives voice to the ghosts who died in the American War. The ghosts of my friends, the ghosts of my family, and the ghosts of all the Vietnamese civilians and soldiers who were killed in the war. It relives the last 25 years of my healing process from a war I did not wish to fight, in which I fought against in the streets when I returned home from Vietnam. The front page of the book is a beautiful, pristine Vietnam countryside, and the last page of the book shows a pastoral image of a Vietnamese peasant harvesting rice. And so in death is life, in grief, love, in war, reconciliation. Such is the legacy I wanted to leave behind in No Thanks, of healing through suffering toward a more hopeful future. I believe that is the legacy of my life, and I believe that is the reason I was chosen to survive.
It's named No Thanks. So, like, to whom or what you are implying by giving the name to the book?
Well, if you can see the cover, the cover is the wall.
The memorial wall.
The memorial wall that we have. And
is that in Washington, the memorial wall?
It's in Washington, D.C.
Yes.
And so I put the title of the poem over that wall because I feel like no thanks to this war, no thanks to this experience, no thanks to the deaths, and the war memorial never should have happened.
Yes. So after this visit, what will you take home and what does Vietnam mean to you?
I will take home a whole lot of poems.
The inspiration of
a new book. The last chapter of The Light Where Shadows End, which is the memoir. It's called The Light Where Shadows End. I will bring back those faces from the members and the handshakes of the members of the People's Army that was so friendly to me, and I was so thankful for that. I will bring back a public understanding of the legacy of war that needs to be shared with the American public. I think that the great images is the Vietnamese smiling face and welcoming of me as a veteran. Those are life-changing.
Thank you so much, Ross, for coming back so that we can have a time sitting here and listening to your inspiring story about your time here in Vietnam. And we hope that the experience that you gathered during this trip back to Vietnam since the end of the war will stay with you. And we do look forward to the launch of your memoir and your next book of poems. So thank you so much once again.
Thank you for being such a gracious host, and thank you for the Vietnamese people for being so welcoming and hospitable to a former enemy.
Thank you so much.
And now friend.
Thank you. And this edition of Talk Vietnam is about the life story of a U.S. veteran called Ross Kenton from the United States. He has overcome the post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD. He's now striving to healing the wounds that war have left in his fellow veterans as well as in Vietnam. Thank you very much for your time, and goodbye for now.